What if everything you thought you knew about history was hiding a secret no one dared to tell? Empires rose and fell, wars raged, fortunes were lost, and ordinary people paid the ultimate price. Hidden truths have shaped the world we live in today. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover the invisible forces, money, power, and betrayal, that decided the fate of nations. And by the end, you'll realize history isn't just about the past, it's about what's coming next. The map was never meant to move. But one morning, it did. Ink crept westward across paper in a quiet office, far from the jungle heat and muddy rivers it claimed to define. A thin line, almost polite, yet that line carried the weight of armies, debt, and hunger. For the people living beneath it, nothing about it was abstract. In Venezuela, dawn came the same way it always had. Roosters, footsteps, the slow creak of doors opening to another day of uncertainty. Farmers stepped into fields that did not know which empire now believed it owned them. Mothers counted grain, already stretching meals thinner than yesterday. Children learned early that borders were not fences, but decisions made by strangers who would never hear them cry. Across the border, British surveyors worked in silence. They did not carry rifles openly. They carried instruments, chains, compasses, ledgers. Each measurement was calm, methodical, and devastating. No shouting, no banners, just the steady theft of ground, mile by mile, justified by maps few locals had ever seen. This was how empires advanced when cannons were inconvenient. In London, the issue appeared small, a colonial adjustment, a rational correction. The empire was used to thinking in increments, territories added, costs absorbed, profits delayed. Yet beneath the polished tables and velvet curtains, the mood was not confident. It was tired. Britain had been everywhere for too long. Its navy ruled the oceans, but each ship drank coal and money without mercy. Each colony demanded administration, protection, and endless attention. The empire's wealth was real, but so was its exhaustion. Loans stacked atop loans. Interest compounded quietly. The numbers no longer inspired pride. They inspired worry. Still, old habits die slowly, and power rarely admits fear. So the maps moved. In Venezuela, the effect was immediate. Merchants saw prices shift before official news arrived. Speculation traveled faster than truth. Rumors passed through markets like smoke. Would British law replace local rule? Would taxes rise? Would land be seized? Questions had no answers, only consequences. Men gathered at night whispering, not of rebellion but of survival. They had seen what empires did elsewhere. They knew that once an imperial line hardened, lives bent around it or broke beneath it. Soldiers were posted along disputed areas, young men with worn boots and older faces than their years deserved. They were not trained for glory. They were trained to stand, to wait, to hope the decision of distant capitals would not demand their blood. Their families waited too. Letters arrived slowly, if at all. News came distorted. Each silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. A knock on the door could mean nothing or everything. Meanwhile, across the sea, another nation watched. The United States had been born in defiance of empire, but memory alone does not shape policy. Money does, trade does, stability does, and the Americas were fragile, stitched together by commerce that could unravel with a single miscalculation. In Washington, officials studied reports not with anger, but with unease. British movement near Venezuela was not an isolated act. It was a test of limits, of resolve, of whether the Western Hemisphere was still open for European ambition. This was not about sympathy, it was about spillover. War in South America would not stay local. Markets would tremble. Shipping lanes would choke. Insurance rates would soar. Investors would panic. And panic was expensive. Behind closed doors, calculations replaced rhetoric. How much instability could the economy absorb? How much risk before confidence cracked? America had grown, but it was not invulnerable. Its people still remembered inflation, shortages, and the invisible scars of internal war. The question was never whether Britain was right. It was whether Britain could afford to be challenged, and whether America could afford to stay silent. In London, ministers sensed the shift even before it was spoken aloud. Diplomatic cables grew sharper in tone. Words like principle and precedent appeared more frequently, thinly veiling concern. The empire had faced rebellions before, but this was different. This was not a colony pushing back. This was a nation with growing financial gravity. Empires feared many things, but nothing unsettled them like uncertainty in credit markets. At the same time, ordinary British citizens felt pressure tightening. Prices rose subtly. Taxes lingered. Wages lagged. They did not know Venezuela's name, nor did they need to. They felt the empire's weight in quieter ways, in shorter meals, longer hours, and the unspoken understanding that greatness came at a cost they always paid. The distance between decision-makers and civilians had never been wider. In Venezuela, the land itself seemed to wait. Rivers flowed indifferent to flags. Forests held their breath. Villages existed in a suspended moment, caught between what they were and what they might be forced to become. No battles had begun, but fear was already working overtime. Fear is expensive. It slows trade, it freezes plans, it drains hope. And hope, once gone, is harder to replace than gold. This was the shock, not an explosion, not a declaration of war, but the realization that a single imperial step could tip an entire region toward chaos, and that stopping it would require something more dangerous than weapons. It would require a confrontation of power, prestige, and money, played out in words that could either preserve peace or make war inevitable. And every silence, every delay, every measured response only deepened the tension, as if the world itself was waiting for someone to speak first. Money does not scream when it vanishes. It whispers. It disappears from pockets before anyone notices, from markets before alarms are raised, from futures before they are even imagined. By the time people feel it, the damage has already settled into their bones. Across continents, nations were bleeding wealth without a single shot fired. War had become a furnace that never cooled. Ships had to be fed, armies clothed, bureaucracies sustained. Each decision demanded currency, and currency demanded sacrifice. Governments borrowed against tomorrow, again and again, promising victories they could not yet afford. Debt piled quietly, like snow before collapse. In London, the numbers grew harder to explain, not because they were complex, but because they were relentless. Interest did not care about patriotism. Creditors did not salute flags. Every month, payments arrived like a reminder that empire ran on borrowed time. The public never saw the full picture. They were not meant to. They saw prices rise instead, bread costing more, coal stretched thinner, rent climbing while wages stood still. No speeches connected these moments to distant borders, but people felt the connection anyway, in the way anxiety lingered after sunset. Mothers learned new arithmetic, how to divide less among more, how to stretch meals without calling it hunger. Fathers worked longer hours, not for ambition, but to hold ground against decline. Children watched, absorbing lessons no classroom could teach. Across the ocean, American factories roared, but even abundance carried tension. Production demanded stability. Investors demanded certainty. Every rumor of conflict in the hemisphere caused hesitation, the kind that slowed expansion and froze capital in place. Banks noticed before politicians did. Loans tightened. Insurance premiums shifted. Futures contracts hesitated. The invisible architecture of commerce began to strain, and those who understood it knew how fragile confidence could be. A war anywhere could become a recession everywhere. In Venezuela, the struggle was immediate and intimate. Markets responded to whispers. Merchants raised prices to protect themselves, not knowing if protection would be enough. Coins passed hands more slowly. Credit dried up. People learned that fear could empty a purse faster than theft. Workers were paid the same but could buy less. Farmers harvested crops without knowing who would tax them. Traders hesitated to move goods through regions that might soon belong to someone else. Every pause carried cost, and no one issued refunds for uncertainty. Governments met behind doors thick with wood and secrecy. Maps lay open beside financial ledgers. Decisions were weighed not in morality, but in survivability. How much debt could a nation absorb before it cracked? How many citizens could endure hardship before unrest followed? The answers were never clear, only estimates, and estimates were dangerous things to trust. In Britain, pride collided with reality. The empire had survived wars before, but those wars had been different. They had been fought in a world where debt was slower, where economies moved at the pace of ships and horses. Now capital moved faster than orders. Panic could cross oceans overnight. The empire's strength was visible. Its weakness was invisible. And invisibility was what made it terrifying. Some officials argued for resolve, others argued for restraint. The debate was never about Venezuela alone. It was about precedent, about whether yielding now would invite challenges later, about whether standing firm would trigger costs no one could truly calculate. Meanwhile, civilians absorbed the consequences without context. A dock worker noticed fewer shipments. A shopkeeper noticed customers buying less. A family postponed a wedding, sensing that uncertainty was a debt of its own. These were not dramatic moments. They were quiet losses accumulating until they formed something heavy. In Washington, the concern deepened. America's economy was growing, but growth was fragile. It relied on trade routes, on trust, on the belief that the hemisphere would not descend into imperial competition. Stability was not idealism, it was an investment. Officials studied Britain's finances closely, not out of hostility, but out of necessity. They saw an empire stretched thin, reliant on credit, vulnerable to pressure that did not require violence. This was a new kind of battlefield, money versus momentum, debt versus patience. Every choice risked escalation. Every delay risked collapse. The ordinary people caught between these calculations never voted on them. They never signed the loans. They never drew the maps. Yet, their lives were the collateral. Inflation crept like a shadow. Savings lost value without warning. The future felt smaller, more fragile. People stopped planning years ahead. They planned weeks, sometimes days. This was the struggle. Not armies clashing, but economies straining. Not heroes charging forward, but families holding on. The world felt unsteady, as if resting on a ledger balanced too precisely, one misstep away from tipping into something irreversible. The message did not arrive with thunder. It arrived folded, sealed, carried by protocol and restraint. Ink on paper, steady and deliberate, crossed the ocean where fleets once ruled. No drums, no marching boots, just words arranged carefully enough to carry weight without igniting fire. In Washington, the air felt heavier than usual. Lamps burned late. Voices stayed low. Every sentence drafted was measured twice, then measured again. Not for poetry, for consequence. One phrase too sharp could summon war. One phrase too weak could invite surrender disguised as diplomacy. This was not bravado, it was risk management. Officials sat with maps spread wide, but their eyes kept drifting to financial reports stacked beside them. Columns of numbers, projections, warnings, the cost of action, the cost of inaction, both terrifying, both unavoidable. Outside those rooms, life continued unaware. Streetcars rattled, workers returned home with tired hands. Families ate dinners that tasted ordinary, not knowing how close their world hovered to disruption. They did not hear the arguments. They did not see the drafts discarded. They only trusted that someone somewhere would keep catastrophe distant. Across the Atlantic, Britain sensed the shift before the message was fully read. The tone was unfamiliar, calm, assertive, unyielding without being aggressive. It did not threaten invasion. It did not demand retreat. It stated expectation. And expectation, when backed by growing power, carried its own menace. This was a line drawn without muskets. British officials read slowly, twice, 3 times. They searched for exaggeration, for weakness, for a bluff. They found none. The language was controlled, almost patient, which made it more dangerous. Empires were used to defiance from rebels. They were less prepared for restraint from equals. In London, silence filled rooms usually loud with confidence. The empire had faced ultimatums before, but rarely from a nation that had learned so quickly how power truly worked. This was not about ships gathering in harbors. This was about markets reacting, about investors whispering, about credit tightening before any soldier moved. The message implied consequences without naming them. And unnamed consequences were the hardest to fight. In Venezuela, the tension sharpened. News traveled imperfectly, but people felt something shifting. Soldiers noticed officers listening more closely, speaking less. Merchants hesitated before setting prices. Farmers delayed decisions, sensing that the ground beneath them was waiting for permission to stay still. No celebration followed, only anticipation. This was the turning point where fear began to change direction. In Britain, ministers weighed pride against arithmetic. The empire could assert itself. It still had the navy, the experience, the history. But assertion came with invoices, coal, crews, maintenance, insurance. Every show of strength drained reserves already stretched thin. Behind closed doors, voices questioned what victory would even look like. A reinforced border? A symbolic stand? Would any of it justify the economic shock that might follow? War was no longer an isolated event. It rippled outward, touching stock exchanges, wages, food prices. The empire had learned that lesson the hard way. In America, restraint held. No troops mobilized. No ships repositioned for spectacle. The power was in the pause, in the willingness to let the words do their work, to trust that the weight of economic reality would press harder than any cannon. Yet that restraint was not effortless. It demanded discipline, a steady hand, the understanding that patience itself could provoke anxiety. Critics whispered. Some demanded force. Others feared weakness. Leadership meant absorbing that noise without letting it shape the outcome. The waiting began. Days passed, then weeks. Each delay tightened the atmosphere. Newspapers speculated cautiously. Markets reacted nervously. Every fluctuation felt like a verdict forming. In London, the empire's advisors could no longer ignore the signs. Investors asked questions. Lenders adjusted terms. Confidence wavered, not because of military inferiority, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty was poison to empire. The realization settled slowly, painfully. This was not a confrontation that could be won on the deck of a ship. In Venezuela, hope crept in quietly, not optimism. Just the faint sense that survival might not require sacrifice this time, that perhaps for once decisions made far away might spare those closest to the fault line. Still, no one relaxed. They had learned better. The world watched two powers circle each other without touching. Diplomacy stretched thin, like wire pulled tight. Every statement mattered. Every silence mattered more. This was history reshaping itself without spectacle. A moment where restraint became strategy, where influence replaced invasion, where power announced itself by choosing not to strike, trusting that the cost of resistance would speak louder than force. And in that fragile space between action and retreat, between pride and survival, the future of an entire hemisphere hung suspended, waiting for the next move that might never come. The price was never announced. It revealed itself slowly. It appeared in smaller portions, in thinner loaves, in wages that arrived unchanged while everything else grew heavier. No decree explained it. No flag warned of it. Yet everyone felt it like pressure building in the chest before breath becomes difficult. In Britain, the empire's cost reached homes that had never seen a colony. Kitchens grew quieter. Coal bins emptied faster. Mothers adjusted meals without speaking of why. Fathers learned to measure dignity against necessity, choosing which bills could wait and which could not. No one told them Venezuela's name. They only knew life was becoming narrower. Inflation moved like fog, soft, persistent, impossible to grasp. Coins bought less each week. Savings lost meaning. What had once been enough now barely reached. The war that had not been declared was already charging interest. In the streets, conversations changed tone. Fewer jokes, more pauses. The empire was still praised in public, but privately, doubt crept in. How long could greatness be afforded when survival felt increasingly expensive? Across the ocean, the same quiet damage unfolded differently. In Venezuela, uncertainty did what armies could not. It froze motion. Farmers delayed planting. Traders delayed travel. Laborers accepted longer hours for the same pay, knowing refusal meant hunger. The future felt like a promise written in disappearing ink. Children noticed first. They always did. They sensed tension in voices, hesitation in decisions, the way adults stared too long at nothing. Childhood shrank, replaced by awareness that safety was temporary. Meanwhile, governments continued their calculations. Behind polished doors, ministers weighed numbers against people they would never meet. Spreadsheets replaced faces. Forecasts replaced empathy. This was not cruelty, it was distance. And distance made sacrifice easier to authorize. Every option carried cost. To advance meant war. To retreat meant loss of prestige. To wait meant continued economic bleeding. The question was no longer what was right. It was what could be survived. The empire's pride demanded resolve. The empire's balance sheet demanded restraint. Between them stood millions who had no voice in either argument. In Britain, workers gathered outside factories that slowed production. Orders hesitated. Markets sensed instability. When capital grows nervous, it tightens. Jobs followed. A single decision in a distant ministry could ripple outward, touching hands that would never shake those of the decision-makers. In taverns and homes, resentment simmered quietly, not rebellion, fatigue, the kind that settles deep and makes endurance feel endless. In America, the cost was less visible but no less real. Investors pulled back slightly. Projects paused. Banks grew cautious. Growth slowed just enough to be noticed. Stability was expensive to maintain, and even the act of preventing war demanded resources. Ordinary Americans felt it too. Prices nudged upward. Wages stalled. Conversations about opportunity softened into conversations about security. The future remained bright, but its edges blurred. No medals were given for this kind of suffering. In Venezuela, the human toll sharpened. Rumors returned. Borders still felt fragile. Soldiers remained stationed, waiting for orders that might never come. Waiting was its own burden. It demanded patience without promise. Families lived between relief and fear. Each day without conflict felt like a gift that could be reclaimed at any moment. People learned to live without certainty, to plan without guarantees. This was the cost no treaty could erase. Time passed, but pressure did not. It only redistributed itself. Pain spread thinly across populations, diluted enough to avoid explosion, concentrated enough to exhaust. Empires had once relied on spectacle to command loyalty. Now their true test came in kitchens, markets, and workplaces, in how long people could endure quiet sacrifice without seeing reason for it. The illusion of distance collapsed. Decisions made in London affected meals in Caracas. Statements issued in Washington shifted prices in Liverpool. The world had tightened, and every movement echoed. Those who paid the highest price never appeared in records. No monuments would bear their names. They were the ones who skipped meals, postponed dreams, buried ambitions quietly. They carried the weight so that borders could remain abstract. This was the price no one escaped. Not soldiers, not civilians, not nations. And as the tension stretched on, unresolved, the cost continued to accumulate, unseen but undeniable, waiting to be accounted for by someone who would never truly pay it themselves. Retreat does not always look like defeat. Sometimes it looks like restraint disguised as wisdom. In London, the decision did not arrive as a declaration. It emerged slowly, through silence, through meetings that ended without resolution, through papers left unsigned just long enough to suggest hesitation had replaced certainty. The empire had not lost its strength. It had lost its appetite for the cost of using it. The rooms where power lived felt smaller now, not in size, but in confidence. Voices dropped. Arguments softened. What once sounded like command now sounded like calculation. Pride still sat at the table, but it no longer dominated the conversation. Officials studied the numbers again and again. They searched for a version of the future that did not bleed. They found none. Empires are taught to advance. They are not taught how to stop. Outside those rooms, life continued with indifference to strategy. Clerks stamped documents, messengers crossed streets, ships loaded cargo that would sail whether flags moved or not. The machinery of daily life kept turning, even as the machinery of empire began to slow. In Venezuela, something subtle shifted. Soldiers noticed fewer drills, fewer warnings, fewer urgent messages passed down the line. Orders remained, but urgency faded. The men stayed ready, yet the tension in their shoulders loosened just enough to be felt. Civilians sensed it too. Markets steadied. Prices stopped climbing as fast. Not relief, but a pause. The kind that allows people to breathe without trusting the air. No celebration followed. Celebration requires certainty. This moment offered none. Across the Atlantic, the empire wrestled with its own reflection. It had once ruled through motion, through expansion that justified itself by its own momentum. Now momentum threatened to drag it into a conflict that promised nothing but depletion. To retreat openly would wound pride. To advance would wound survival. Between the two, restraint emerged, not as surrender, but as preservation. Diplomatic language adjusted, words softened, certainty blurred into openness. Arbitration became acceptable. Compromise stopped sounding like weakness and started sounding like necessity. The empire did not announce it was stepping back. It simply stopped stepping forward. Markets noticed first. Confidence stabilized. Lenders relaxed slightly. The invisible pressure eased, not because danger had vanished, but because direction had changed. Capital, always alert to hesitation, recalibrated. This was how modern power shifted, quietly, without spectacle. In Britain's streets, the change felt indirect but real. Prices stopped rising as fast. Anxiety lingered, but it no longer sharpened daily. People did not know why. They only knew the tightening had paused. In Venezuela, families allowed themselves small acts of normalcy. A postponed purchase finally made, a field planted, a plan spoken aloud without immediate fear of being undone. Still, no one trusted permanence. Empires do not retreat often, and when they do, history watches closely. In private, officials acknowledged the truth they could never state publicly. This confrontation had revealed something uncomfortable. Power had changed shape. Control was no longer enforced solely through dominance. It was constrained by economics, by interconnected systems that punished excess swiftly and without mercy. The empire had not been pushed back by armies, it had been checked by arithmetic. This realization carried weight, not just for this moment, but for every moment that would follow. If one border dispute could threaten financial stability, what would happen when challenges multiplied? If restraint preserved order now, would it be demanded again? These questions lingered unanswered, reshaping doctrine in silence. Across the ocean, America observed without triumph. There was no parade, no declaration of victory. This was not conquest, it was confirmation. Confirmation that influence could replace invasion, that pressure could be applied without bloodshed, that the future belonged to those who understood leverage better than violence. Yet even this knowledge carried unease, because if empires could retreat without firing a shot, they could also return the same way. In Venezuela, the land remained unchanged. Rivers flowed, forests stood, borders stayed where they were, for now. But the memory of how easily they could have moved lingered. People understood that survival had come not from strength, but from timing and circumstance. The retreat did not erase fear, it taught restraint. In London, the empire absorbed the moment quietly. Official statements framed it as reasoned judgment, as diplomacy functioning as intended. Behind those words lived an admission that power had limits now more visible than ever. Limits imposed not by enemies, but by interconnected worlds that punished overreach. The empire stepped back, not because it was forced, but because it calculated that stepping forward would cost more than it could justify. And in that calculation, something ancient shifted. The idea that expansion was inevitable. The belief that prestige outweighed consequence. The confidence that retreat equaled failure. None of it held the same certainty anymore. This was not the end of empire, but it was a lesson it could not unlearn. And as the world adjusted to this quieter reality, the tension did not disappear. It settled, waiting, learning, watching how long restraint could last before pride demanded movement again. The world did not notice the shift all at once. It rarely does. Change like this does not arrive with explosions. It settles in quietly, altering expectations before anyone thinks to name it. Borders remained where they were, flags still flew, soldiers still drilled. Yet something fundamental had moved beneath the surface, reshaping how power understood itself. Money had spoken, and it had been heard. In offices far from jungles and rivers, new assumptions took root. Strength was no longer measured only by fleets assembled or troops deployed. It was measured by resilience, by creditworthiness, by how much strain a nation could absorb without fracturing from within. This realization did not inspire celebration, it inspired caution. Governments began to watch markets as closely as borders. Finance ministers gained voices as loud as generals. Decisions once framed as strategic became financial first, military second, not because leaders had grown gentler, but because the cost of ignoring economics had become impossible to hide. Ordinary people felt the shift before they understood it. They sensed a new fragility in the world, a sense that stability depended on systems they could not see, controlled by forces they would never meet. The future felt conditional now, dependent on balances that could tip without warning. In Venezuela, life resumed its rhythm, but never its innocence. The memory of near erasure lingered. People understood how close they had come to being absorbed by decisions made thousands of miles away. Survival had not come from strength or unity, but from timing and external restraint. That knowledge settled deep. Children grew up learning that borders were negotiable, that protection could arrive indirectly, that safety was often a byproduct of someone else's calculation. These lessons were not taught, they were absorbed, quietly shaping a generation's understanding of power. In Britain, the empire continued. Ships sailed, trade flowed, authority remained. But the confidence had changed texture. Expansion was no longer automatic. Each move invited scrutiny. Each decision demanded justification beyond tradition. Officials remembered how close restraint had come to necessity, how easily pride could have triggered collapse. That memory tempered ambition. The empire had not fallen, but it had blinked. In America, the moment reinforced a growing identity, influence without occupation, pressure without invasion, leadership exercised through stability, rather than domination. This approach carried its own burden. It required constant vigilance, constant calculation, the awareness that economic power could provoke resentment just as surely as military force. Power had become quieter, and quieter power was harder to challenge. Markets adjusted, investors recalibrated risk, trade expanded cautiously. Confidence returned, but differently, less naive, more conditional. The world economy had revealed its interconnected fragility, and no one forgot it entirely. For civilians everywhere, the legacy felt abstract but persistent. Opportunities expanded unevenly. Security felt provisional. People learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion, not an exception. They learned that wars could be fought without battles, that suffering could spread without violence, that the most decisive confrontations might never make headlines. This new shape of power did not erase conflict. It refined it. Struggles moved into negotiation rooms, into currency exchanges, into loan agreements written in language dense enough to obscure their impact. Victories were claimed quietly, losses distributed widely. Those who understood the system gained leverage, those who did not bore the cost. The world became more cautious, but not more kind. Decisions still favored survival over justice, stability over fairness. The difference was in visibility. Consequences arrived faster now, leaving less room for denial. History continued forward, carrying this lesson like a scar. Not always visible, never forgotten. Empires adapted, nations recalculated, people endured. And beneath it all, the balance remained uneasy, suspended between restraint and ambition, between memory and temptation, waiting to see which force would speak louder the next time lines on a map began to move again.